I want to talk today about when God plans a party, the party will happen. And so you better be dressed. That's kind of like the summary of these two parables that we hear today. And just to contextualize this a little bit, here's what's been happening the last 5 weeks. You know, Jesus in his life, he's in Holy Week. So he had just come into the city of Jerusalem triumphantly on a donkey with palms, if you remember Palm Sunday. So this is actually happening now. Jesus is 2 or 3 days in that week in the temple, and he's preaching, and he's confronting people with the truth of the kingdom of God being present. And some of the people he's confronting would be the chief priests and the Pharisees. And this is the 5th parable that is designed for them, and then us by analogy. So this parable is actually a combination of 2 parables put together. So if you're familiar with the verses, 1 through 10 is parable 1, 11 through 14 is parable 2. And so parable 1 is in Luke and Matthew. So we know that that's one that was spread around the early kingdom of Christians. And then parable 2, the one about the man who's not dressed appropriately for the wedding, that one's an add-on just particular to Matthew. So let's see if we can make some sense out of what this all means. So in the first parable, you have a king who has a son who is going to be married. And so the king is now preparing a banquet, a wedding banquet. Now, we know that all of those are symbolic kinds of terms. So the king is God, all right? The son is kind of Jesus in a sense, and then the wedding banquet is the kingdom, okay? So what does the king do? The first attribute of the king is determined to have the wedding banquet filled. So that is the goal, to have them filled. And so the obvious people at first would be the people who would have some nobility to them. So apparently they got that card in the mail that said, save the date. But the unfortunate thing is that they're not responding. So what the king now has to do is he has to send his servants out to find out what's happening. And so he does. And he gets to report back that they're not interested. And then he sends back more servants because the king is determined to have his banquet filled. He sends out more servants saying, well, you know, my oxen and my calves are all killed and slaughtered and they're being prepared right now. We need people at this wedding feast. And so what do these elected elite do? Well, they say, okay, interesting, but we're not interested. One goes to his farm, another goes to his property, and then some of them, you know, start to disparage the messengers, and some of them kill them. Imagine that. Now, that kind of like ticks off the king, doesn't it? But in a sense, what it does is it then allows the king to be inclusive. So, slaves, what you do next is you go out and you invite everybody that you see, because this king is determined. My banquet will be filled. And so the servants go out, they go beyond the main streets into the far recesses of the kingdom, and they offer invitations to the good and the bad, and they all come in droves. And they're happy to be there. So what do we know about God for us in that parable? Here's what we know. God doesn't give up, okay? The people that you would expect to come, sometimes they don't, but God still finds a way to get the invitation out to you and me. And the invitation is inclusive, and God is like the hound of heaven, will not let us go, will pursue us to the nth degree. See, you're invited to be in the kingdom because God is determined to be inclusive, to have you here. God's kind of like this. I heard a story recently where there was this music director in a school, in a church, and had a group of kids, 10 or so kids, that were preparing to sing for a very special occasion. And one of those kids was a boy by the name of Justin who suffered from autism. And so those of you who are familiar with autism, you know that some of these children who suffer from that, they have to do what we call stimming. So they'll do behaviors like bounce their heads against the carpet, just to deal with the anxiety, or they'll pat their knees a lot. But this little boy, Justin, his stimming to deal with anxiety was he would do somersaults. So the mother explained that to the choir director, that Justin can sing and he has a beautiful voice. It's real high, it's melodic, it's just a wonderful voice, but he'll have to do that by doing somersaults. Now, can you imagine there being some churches that wouldn't allow someone somersaulting while singing in the choir? But in this particular church, because it kind of like took after the king in the parable, who was relentless in pursuing and making it welcoming, they prepared a space for this kid to do his somersault so that he could sing in somersault. And so they had their first practice, and the 10 kids were singing, and Justin was somersaulting and singing with a wonderful voice, and the kids asked the question, they said, "Why is he doing that?" And the music director said to him, "Well, Justin's brain processes things differently than yours. This is what he has to do in order to sing." And here's what the kids said, "Oh, okay." And they continued to sing. Now, isn't that kind of nice? See, that's kind of like how God makes it possible for all of us to be invited into the wedding banquet. So I think that's the message of the first part of the parable. Okay, that just remember that you are invited and that your God will pursue you and will even make exceptions to get you here and to keep you here, because the kingdom's open to all people. Now, sometimes what you're going to find is those who you expect to be here aren't, but the right people are always here, and so we want to carry that message. So that's the first part of the parable. So you're invited. You're invited. You're so welcome to be here. Now, the second part is a little peculiar, because what happens next is the king is moving around and he notices that there's one guest who is not appropriately attired. Now, in the olden days, now if this was actually literal, probably what that would mean is this, that royal weddings, they not only sent you an invitation, they sent you what to wear. See, everyone was kind of like a maid of honor or a bridesmaid or a groomsman. Everyone had their garment because that's how they controlled who got fed. You see? But this is not actually what Matthew is trying to get across, according to a lot of the commentators, and some things he says in another place. But once you get the invitation to come into the kingdom, or into the place where those who are rejoicing in salvation go, that it's not enough just to say yes to the invite. There's something more that's expected. So, we have a king who is inclusive, certainly, but will all who are invited stay? Well, all who are dressed well will. Now, what does that mean to be dressed well? Well, not with a garment, okay? Like, for example, you may be on Facebook and you might be following this little controversy going on with a little girl for her first Holy Communion that's be had today. So there was, it's in a Catholic church somewhere in Maryland, I think it is, and her name is Katie, and Katie loves pantsuits. And so during the summer, there was an invitation put out that Katie and her class were going to be making their first Holy Communion, and it's going to be on October 15th, which is today. And so all the parents were invited to go out and buy their kids something white for this occasion. There was only one stipulation, one thing that wasn't allowed, and that was a spaghetti strap dress. That wasn't allowed, but everything else was. So what did the parents do with Katie? Well, since Katie loved these pantsuits and she's 9 years old, she wanted to go and get a beautiful white pantsuit. And so they had trouble finding the best pantsuit, but they did. They got it mail order and then it came in. So Katie had pictures taken of the way she looked, and then 4 days ago, they got word that Katie wasn't allowed to wear a pantsuit, that she had to wear a dress. Now, this caused a little bit of a conflict because, she individually expressed herself in this. She looked very pretty, and the parents felt, and so many other people, that why can't she just wear this pantsuit? Isn't she properly attired? And it went back and forth, and then the priest came down very sternly. No, she cannot receive communion with her class if she wears that. She can have that after the ceremony, but not with the classmates. Now, the parents then thought that wasn't fair, and so they went to the priest, and they talked to him a little bit about this, and he said, well, I don't like your parenting style. You should make her do a dress. And so anyway, you know where that all ended up. They're no longer in that church. Okay, now, see, it's not that kind of literal interpretation, We're not talking about that. So we would never consider that. Plus, in our church, we'd be okay with whatever you would wear, But we get literal. If you get too literal, you'll miss the point. See, what is that clothing that we ought to be wearing once we're invited to this wedding, symbolically, to participate in the kingdom? Well, we're going to be doing it for Paige here in a couple minutes. You see, Paige is being baptized. I think she's wearing white. Usually what happens, I needed to check that first, but I didn't notice that. I think she's wearing white. And, there's two times in Christian tradition that we make a little bit of a reference to clothing. One is at baptism, the clothes of baptism. And then often, if you're still buried, not in cremains, but with a casket, in many places a white pall is put over the casket when it comes into the church. And the prayer is, may the Lord who clothed you in your baptism, may he now or she now clothe you in glory. And so those are two times. So what's that all about? Well, she's going to teach that to us today. What's happening today in her life is she is accepting the clothing of being saved. See, not only has her parents been invited and they've accepted the invitation on her behalf, the next thing that's happening is we're symbolically and sacramentally baptizing her, which means from here on out, she is always clothed in Jesus. She is saved. We have to act like it. See, we have to look like we're saved. That's what was missing in this particularly inappropriately dressed individual at that wedding feast. Not necessarily the clothes, but are you acting and looking like you're saved? There was a poll put out, I read this in preparing for this sermon, that there's several different characters that you could relate to in that parable today. You can be the king, you can be the servant, you can be the inappropriately dressed person. And Christians were asked, which of those people do you feel that you most resemble? And 78% of the people who responded said, guess which one? The inappropriately dressed. Is that how we do feel? If we do, we need to change that. See, that's the kind of thing that might make you look like you're not appropriately dressed. So, what do? Well, you realize that you're okay. See, with your baptism, with your involvement, with your joining here, you've accepted the invitation. Now, feel like you really belong. See, you are saved. It doesn't matter so much what you do in the church. The most important thing is that you remember that in the church, you're here because you're okay. And you appropriate that you are clothed in glory already. Get that into your core, and I believe that you're going to be doing lots and lots of things that will surprise you. So, let's now sacramentally do this, all right? And this will be a reminder to all of us that we are okay. We are okay. We are sons and daughters of God Almighty. The King invites us to the wedding feast and keeps us here. Let's dress for the occasion.